Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight b1 to d2. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn e4 to e5. Knight f6 to d7. Bishop f1 to d3. Pawn c7 to c5. Pawn c2 to c3. Knight b8 to c6. Knight g1 to e2. Pawn c5 takes d4. Pawn c3 takes d4. Knight d7 to b6. Castle kingside. Bishop f8 to e7. Pawn a2 to a3. Castle kingside. Pawn b2 to b3. Bishop c8 to d7. Bishop c1 to b2. Pawn f7 to f6. Knight d2 to f3. Pawn f6 takes e5. Knight f3 takes e5. Knight c6 takes e5. Pawn d4 takes e5. Rook a8 to c8. Rook a1 to c1. Rook c8 takes c1. Queen d1 takes c1. Queen d8 to c8. Knight e2 to d4. Queen c8 to b8. Queen c1 to e3. Rook f8 to c8. Rook f1 to c1. Rook c8 takes c1, check. Bishop b2 takes c1. Queen b8 to f8. Queen e3 to h3. Bishop e7 takes a3. Bishop d3 takes h7, check. King g8 to h8. Knight d4 takes e6. Bishop d7 takes e6. Bishop c1 takes a3. Bishop e6 takes h3. Bishop a3 takes f8. Bishop h3 takes g2. Bishop f8 takes g7, check. King h8 takes h7. Pawn f2 to f4. Pawn d5 to d4. Pawn f4 to f5. Bishop g2 to d5. Pawn f5 to f6. Bishop d5 takes b3. King g1 to f2. Pawn a7 to a5. King f2 to f3. Bishop b3 to d5, check. King f3 to f4. Pawn a5 to a4. Pawn h2 to h4. King h7 to g6. Bishop g7 to f8. King g6 to h5. King f4 to g3. Knight b6 to c4. King g3 to f4. Pawn b7 to b5. Bishop f8 to c5. Pawn d4 to d3. Bishop c5 to f2. Pawn d3 to d2. Pawn f6 to f7. Bishop d5 takes f7. Pawn e5 to e6. Bishop f7 takes e6. Bishop f2 to d4. King h5 takes h4. Bishop d4 to f6, check. King h4 to h5. King f4 to e4. Pawn b5 to b4. Bishop f6 to d4. Knight c4 to d6, check. King e4 to e5. Pawn d2 to d1, promoting to queen. Bishop d4 to c5. Queen d1 to d5, check. King e5 to f4. Queen d5 takes c5. King f4 to f3. Pawn b4 to b3. King f3 to e2. Queen c5 to c2, check. King e2 to e3. Pawn a4 to a3. King e3 to d4. Pawn b3 to b2. King d4 to e5. Pawn a3 to a2. King e5 takes e6. Knight d6 to e4. King e6 to f5. Queen c2 to b1. King f5 to e5. King h5 to g4. King e5 to d4. King g4 to f3. King d4 to d5. Queen b1 to a1. King d5 to d4. Queen a1 to b1. King d4 to d5. Queen b1 to a1. King d5 to d4. Queen a1 to c1. King d4 to d3. Queen c1 to c3, checkmate.